Thank you so much, Máximo. Well, we open the discussion. Yes, sir?
Máximo, on the statistic about cellular penetration in rural... sorry. On the statistic about cellular penetration in rural areas where you had percentages, were those percentages of people or percentages of households? When you showed the difference between cellular penetration in urban and rural areas by percentages?
Households. Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes you find statistics which are population, but every household still has a...
Yeah, exactly. So if any member of the household has a connection, then it will be there. So, so the gap is big. I was surprised in certain countries that the gap was so big. In cellular phones, no?
Thank you.
And this comes from the LSMS service.
Any other question? You perhaps? Yeah. I think that we need to, especially the bank, to show what are the good practice, what are better practice than the others, and indicate to the people what is, for you and for your institution, that is very important, of course, what is the good practice to for example, we have here with a question that put Negroponte, what is better, the collaboration of the private sector or the states, or a mixture about state, and we need to individualize the good practice to follow.
A very important question. You know, I represent the board of the bank. I am not the bank, but so I represent my countries. But so look, in terms of the ways to create this access, this connectivity, I think in this point of time, and with all the experience in Latin America, because Latin America has been very active in improving access to telecommunications and improving regulation, the combination of private and public is a crucial way to go. One of the major successes that we have in telephone penetration in rural areas was the funds that were developed with shares of the revenues from the private companies, and there were competitive bids for the minimum subsidy. So basically, companies will compete for the minimum subsidy to be able to reduce and to have increased the access and to minimize the market failure. So that's a way to go, and it's a way in which education is moving in a certain way. In many countries, education is now becoming a combination of public and private entrepreneurship. So I think learning from what failed and what worked is not only what worked, it's also what failed. Is something to move around. In what refers at least to the content that I know, in terms of the content inside ICTs and so on and so forth, clearly just doing a very simple assessment of the needs of agricultural farmers could help enormously to benefit the profits of that connectivity. Because if not, they won't benefit from it, and they will stop using it, and governments have invested lots of money in systems to do this, and nobody uses them. My country is one example of that. So doing rapid assessments, rapid field appraisals of what is needed, I think could help enormously to create competitive bids to provide that type of information in the best possible way. The bank has now this approach of the cascade, which is basically whatever the private sector cannot do, the public sector should come in and resolve that market failure or that missing market. And I think the idea that we're discussing here fits a lot into it. So if we want to jump into connectivity, I think this could be a way in which $1 that the public sector push in can come with $2 or $3 from the private sector to move in. But again, I still have the concern that this graph of the institutionality of the complements is showing what is happening today, and we want to change that drastically, if that's what I understood. And if we want to change that drastically, we need to figure out how we create this technology or how we use whatever is today the technology so that we can jump over that requirement of sequential institutionality, which is too complex for countries that don't have it in place, and that's Asia, Africa, and some Latin American countries.
Thank you so much, Brown.
Máximo, how does IT connectivity relate today to rural electrification? What's the interaction in low-income countries? From what I see from our field research, students in my team do there's still a very strong relationship. And if that's the case, that would be an argument for Nicolas Negroponte that first gets the hard infrastructure in, and then so no trade, don't trade off investments in content against getting the connectivity, including the electrification infrastructure in place. What's your comment?
Most of my work on infrastructure has been on complementarities of infrastructure, and clearly electricity plus ICTs has a higher payout than each one by itself, which tells you that they have huge complementarity. In many cases, so what is happening in terms of electrification, you have off-grid and on-grid, no? And today, there is a huge push towards off-grid, which is solar and solar energy. And without too much evidence, I think, in terms like the quality of the solar and the capacity of storage is not there yet to give all the services that you need, especially if you want to use intensive electricity. But to answer directly your question, yes, there is a huge, I think there is an important complementarity. There is simple delivery mechanisms of very basic connectivity to electricity, like the core, similar could be for connectivity, like a bundle that you want to provide. In electricity, basically, we provide 2 plugs and 1 light bulb over which you connect, and then the household can grow over that, which will allow the complementarity, but in many areas, you don't have that. And then the solar panels could be an alternative, but again, it will depend on the capacity of storage to be able to link. I had a very sad story, but when I started doing electrification in Ethiopia, I went to rural Ethiopia, and all the kids keep talking about the plasma, where in districts where there was no electricity. And I didn't know what they were talking because it was in the 90-something. I didn't know any plasma TV. So they took me to a school and they had this metal box, enormous metal box, and inside there was a huge plasma put by the World Bank. And they stored it like gold, but there was no electricity. So they couldn't see the classes that they were supposed to see through the video. So yes, I think we need to move together. But honestly, I don't see they are sequential. I think we need to move in parallel.
Any other question? Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you for the talk. In some countries, say, for example, Myanmar, and I think this is maybe not imposed in Nigeria, but at least in practice, there are pricing floors on connectivity which can impact affordability. Do you have, from your experience at the World Bank, do you have any commentary on pricing floors and their impact on people getting connected?
In certain way, the example I put in terms of Brazil, basically we built up a pricing floor there, and we saw how much of the share of your income you will have to spend to be able to access to it, and the poorer you are, the more. So prepaid phone is the most expensive phone minute relative to postpay, no? So yes, it's like water, no? Who pays the most for water? The poor people, because they have to buy water from outside. They don't have a network connection. But they are the ones that are against privatization and expansion of, because basically if you privatize and the price goes up, the ones who will pay more are the richer. So there is a lot of asymmetry of information behind those things, which will allow to more competition around. But yes, and that's linked to the institution part, no? Regulation. My knowledge of regulation, I used to do a lot of regulation in telephones, is that no matter, Peru, for example, had a huge reform in regulatory agencies. In the 90s, they built an amazing system of regulation. It was the model for the World Bank, similar to Chile. What happened after 5-7 years? The big companies basically captured completely the best people because of income, no matter there were laws against moving out and the periods of freezing time that you cannot move out. But they captured the best lawyers, the best specialists in regulation. So today the regulatory mechanisms are pretty low, pretty weak. And as a result of that, you still have this oligopoly power which doesn't allow companies entry and exit, and the interconnection costs are very complex. This is a very complex thing. So again, that's why my logic here is, okay, so if I can have a technology that falls from heaven and will enter no matter what is the market structure there, that's my solution. I don't need to go through all this sequence, but we don't have it yet. If we can find something similar or close to it, I think will help enormously to leapfrog over what we have in countries that you don't have that institutionality, no? What we call complements in the presentation.
Thank you, Máximo. Jeff? You?
Just a wonderful presentation, but just a very basic point, which is let's not forget government provision of basic services, because we're in a mindset typically around Washington of what can the market do. And I think the Uruguay case is the perfect case of a government that's taken on the what to do and created public services for universal access. And the African countries cannot do this on their own, so they need financial support to do it. And usually the rhetoric these days is, well, go borrow or privatize it. But this doesn't work. This is just a shell game of poverty. And we've been through this so many times in the world. The most basic fact is that the provision of basic services for basic needs is beyond the financial possibility of very poor countries. So either poor countries don't have health, or they don't have education services, or they don't have safe water and sanitation, or they are financed by development assistance. When Washington went crazy about 35 years ago by bringing Ronald Reagan to the presidency, and everything became privatized, we lost the basic language to discuss these things, because the basic language would have been what is needed, how much does it cost, what can you afford locally, what is the gap, who's going to fill the gap. And that's truly the basic logic of how such important services should be funded. Nothing's wrong with that model. But we have lost, in a way, the instinct and the language to do it. So we're always trying to play a game of borrow, cost recovery, start with the rich, the poor will catch up, see what happens, hire some private companies. And it's, you know, it can never work. So that's not what you're saying, but I mean, I understand that. I understand that, but that's how we talk about it. There is no budget constraint at the global level. There's only a budget constraint at the local level. The world is so rich that a tiny, tiny fraction of the income of the rich countries closes all of these financing gaps and enables all of these things to be implemented. So anyway, I just think it's important to, and it's a question also for Matt, as impressive as what you're finding is, I still like schools, teachers, and would like us to, I'd also like a prize for best low-cost public system to implement the whole thing, rather than thinking that it's kids teaching kids through an amazing thing, which may be also a wonderful complement, but I find it hard to believe it's a substitute for a school system.
Good that you said that. That's not what I was saying, because I wasn't saying that.
Isn't at all your point. It's just we spend so much time worrying about the costs, but the answer is let American taxpayers pay for it.
Yeah.
Let Donald Trump pay for it. Let Sheldon Adelson pay for it. Let the Koch brothers pay for it.
Yeah,
you know, there's so much money around, it's obscene. So we just have to harness it a little bit better.
Yeah, my point here, and the only point I will add to what you are saying is, it could be the way, I don't know, but also the other issue behind is how you can use the resources in the most effective way, no? And that's a big issue. just doing an exercise, no, not really, just doing an exercise of mapping interventions we are doing it in 17 African countries, not the World Bank, but myself, my previous work, and in Latin America, mapping where the money is being spent and where the money was really needed for the different types of activities, shows you that there is a lot of potential improvement in the effectiveness of the dollar being used. But
Not in poor countries.
no, in poor countries, I'm talking of poor countries, African
No,
countries.
I'll tell you, my experience with the World Bank, and, you know, I've argued with the bank for...
But I am not talking about the
Yeah,
World Bank. Right?
but for 30 years, the bank would say, in Kenya, we had this fight, for example. Kenya was spending, it was able to spend $15 per person on the health system. And the bank said, you're spending the $15 wrong. It's going too much for this. I said, are you kidding? $15? You need $50, $80. You can't even spend $15 wrong. It's too little. So they were not overspending on any category. And it wasn't a fight about the relative levels. It was the total amount that was so woefully inadequate. And the point I'm making is that we study far too much how the poor are inefficient with their money and study far too little how we can give them more money.
Yeah, but remember, Jeff, I think that's very important, is the ones who allocate the money are not the poor. So
The ones that allocate the money are nasty rich people, is my point.
Exactly.
I know, but we have to help them be less nasty.
Yeah, but I mean even at the poor country level.
You guys are, can I just pick up on, can I say one thing about, go one step further than Jeff? I personally think the concept of public-private partnerships is terrible. It's a really bad idea. And the whole notion that we're going to privatize something because it's going to run more efficiently and it's going to do this, plagued telecommunications. And do you know that Uruguay is the only country where it's remained public? I think Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Cuba, maybe the three. But Uruguay is an example. What we should do, and I'm never going to get this through this group, but we should publicize, the reverse, all telecommunications companies. Dennis O'Brien has no incentive whatsoever to bring it out to the rural parts unless you incentivize it with more profits. That's the only way he's going to do it. So when you look at those maps, why do they exist? Because telecommunications is primarily in the private sector. That's why. Period. That's the reason. And we've got to change that. I don't know if this group will do it, but...
Nicholas, we heard if I could just,
Now we
sorry.
have a list of, we are a bit later, but we have Matt Keller.
Just two points. One, we also need to get out of the mindset, as you alluded to, that governments like the United States don't have enough. It's too expensive. Things are too expensive. It costs too much, which is absurd. It's just ridiculous. It's obscene the amount we spend on the Department of Defense. To connect the world would be a 10% of what we spend every year. And in the development world, people get into this mindset, well, it just costs so much money, and how do we dare go to DFID and all these other groups and ask for more? But there's plenty. Second thing is the tablets and the technology and building schools are not mutually exclusive. So this is a way to reach more kids faster, and in some ways better. But the two are not mutually exclusive and should continue in parallel.
Yes, Molly?
Thank you. I would like to return to the 3 C's that you brought up: connectivity, content, and capacity, and how we can define connectivity as a human right in relation to content. I'm wondering if you've found some sort of baseline content amount that can help make a definition. You mentioned earlier connectivity as, say, 100 megabytes per month. As content continues to evolve into the realms of virtual reality and augmented reality within the developed world, that's going to create even more massive inequality unless we have the ability to scale our connectivity systems. So I'm wondering how you're addressing that and thinking about it.
We didn't, at least in my research, I was not able still to figure out, because endogenous, as you said, and depends on technology. But the only thing I can say is that in the agricultural sector, what we found is that when the penetration increased of cellular phones, the content that was really targeted to the needs, to local markets, and to the produce that they had, different varieties and so on, it worked well. When we did the experiment of providing exactly the same content in India on potatoes with cellular phones, so private information versus public information, exactly the same content. So public means that somebody went and put the information in a place where people used to come versus giving them through a text system, the impact was exactly the same. The cost effectiveness of the cellular phone was a lot better. No? So I can transfer very quickly information through the phone if I wanted to scale it up. So cost effectiveness was great. But again, the more you target the content to the need, the better the return, and the people were willing to pay for it because they get a benefit from it.
So, Nick, I feel we're consigned to keep going back and forth at some of these issues. On two things. One, I really don't think that we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater and take the view that now we want to see a wholesale move towards public ownership and delivery. I mean, we've got years and years of data that shows grotesque inefficiency with a lot of these infrastructure projects, utilities, with extreme waste, and not particularly attentive. Not particularly attentive to concerns over distributional equity on top of everything else. So again, I think the task here is for us to get smarter government that is able to harness the best of the private sector, but recognizing the key role the government plays in making explicit the kinds of responsibilities, public responsibilities that ought to be vindicated. The other thing, again, as I'm extremely sympathetic to a lot of the concerns that are being expressed around the room in terms of the lamentable and longstanding lack of support from the richest countries for this agenda and these yawning chasms that somehow we seem to be in the developed world inured to. But having said that, I mean, I think we have to recognize, particularly in the country that I've moved to and is now my home, we just, over the last 6 months, have spent a great deal of time and energy beating back several different reforms which, within our own country, would have thrown 23 million people off of healthcare coverage after having spent years getting that sorted out. So, I think how we find a language that can invoke or evoke a sense of people's better angels, reflecting, just the kind of meanness of spirit that exists not just in the United States, but in a number of industrial democracies, and a lack of generosity of spirit is, I think, again, an important part of the conversation we're having. But us asserting it is not going to be sufficient.
You want to answer?
Okay, I just want to, one of the reasons to raise it is not to do a wholesale transformation, but absolutely everybody believes in these public-private partnerships, the privatization, that competition is good and all of that, and sometimes we have to say, pause. And one of the important things, when you asked Miguel Brechner what were his results, why does it work, notice what he said. He didn't say grade scores, he didn't say we're up on the PISA ladder, he didn't say anything. He said equity. That is a public sector view of equity. That's what it is about in Uruguay. And when I went there recently and saw it, I was enormously impressed that that was what they were after. And I think that's a public sector spirit, not the private sector.
And I mean, not to belabor this, but I think one should disassociate public sector from explicitly stating those goals and insisting the private sector adhere to them, rather than just imagining that public delivery, public ownership in itself will do that. Because again, I mean, I came from a province back in Canada, Ontario, where one of the largest utilities in North America was publicly owned, in the sense that this was, by virtue of public ownership, that it was going to be great on distributional issues, great on a host of other issues. And over time, it was just see these concrete instances where public ownership became a showstopper in terms of getting the accountability that you need to have from the delivery of these services. So I'm just saying on distributional issues, on health and safety issues, it was abysmal. And so this is why I'm just, again, I'm sharing with you the enthusiasm for a significant, strong role for government, but it's just a question of instruments to vindicate those responsibilities.
Thank you so much. We can continue the discussion afterwards. Gisela, thank you.